Hey everybody, so today's video is actually inspired by a question that one of you Patreon supporters had, and that was in reference to the timing and the use of the no-tell lunge. Now, as anybody who has ever listened to one of my prior videos, or particularly if you are a student of mine, you already know that I am a strong advocate of whenever you are attacking your opponent, it's always a part of the two-target concept. You attack the sword, then you attack the person behind it. If you don't, then when you strike your opponent, let's say you successfully do so and you actually even get away, it was not a masterful strike because of the fact your opponent could, if they had just even so much as attacked you in the same tempo, could potentially have hit you at the same time that you hit them because you didn't have positive control of the weapon. So this question is about one of you out there stating that you've got a fairly decent use of the no-tell lunge, and if you're unsure about how or why or when to use a no-tell lunge, see my video on the YouTube channel titled The No-Tell Lunge. It'll take you through a quick step-by-step on how to do that. But in this particular instance, when you want to attack your opponent and you want to do so, you're fencing single sword, you want to be the initiator of that attack. Yes, and I'm speaking directly to the person who asked that question, you are correct in that there is something and a timing to which you must apply this attack in order to ensure you have a masterful attack when you do so. Now, Lynn here is facing me as a single swordsman, and keep in mind, we are a little closer than we would normally be for a true fencing measure, just because we want to make sure that we keep everything in the frame. But that aside, that won't actually even come into factor as a play on whether or not you're going to understand this. So Lynn is fencing me as the opponent, and I want to initiate an attack against her. Now, if all I do is initiate a no-tell attack against her, and let's say I do so, and I manage to strike her and I get away. Well, since I didn't do anything with the sword, that shows I did not have positive control, which means it's not a masterful attack. Because if, while I was, say, attacking her head with a no-tell attack, and she just happened by coincidence to launch into an attack, say, to my belly, well, now we're both hitting each other, and although it's a very period way to die, and we're practicing a very period martial art, we want to kind of avoid that particular eventuality. So, when you use the no-tell lunge against your opponent, there are certain times at which you can use it that is the ideal time to do so. So, in all things fencing, when you make your attack against your opponent and you have done so in the right time, keep in mind, you will still make your attack and immediately parry. You will always immediately cover, because in the very next instant, the very next moment of time, that segment, your opponent is going to have an action. Now, because you also have an action in that, you need to make sure that that action is covering the weapon. So understand that this is always the fallback position that you go into after every attack that you make against your opponent. You will make that attack and you will cover your opponent's weapon. Now that we've got that out of the way, the timing of when you use a no-tell attack against your opponent is very specific. You cannot just simply throw your sword out there and hope for the best, because that is relying upon luck, and as we all know, lucky swordsmen eventually run out of luck and then they become dead swordsmen. So, in this instance, always remember that when your opponent commits to an action, they must finish that action before they can then move into the next action. In this particular instance, there are several that you can choose from. For example, if my opponent was to begin a step toward me, in the middle of that step is when you can launch into the attack and have no fear whatsoever that the sword is going to come after you, because she must finish the planting of that back foot before she can launch into the lunge attack against me. So again, as she is stepping, I would launch into my no-tell, make my attack, and then immediately in the next instant, as her foot is coming down, she's got an action that could lead to an attack against me, but so do I. And my action is going to be covering that sword. So again, stepping back, she starts to step, attack, parry. One more time. She starts to step, attack, parry. This is one action that you can attack into with the no-tell lunge, and be doing so in a masterful fashion. Because, as other students may have heard me say I can't even tell you how many hundreds of times, depending on how long they've been learning from me, there are 3 ways that you deal with the threat: force, time, or a combination of force and time. Since we're talking about single sword here, the primary means we're going to use in order to deal with the threat is time. I am utilizing segments of time, the time that she is in, that she cannot make an attack. Therefore, it is safe for me to make my attack, provided, of course, I have done all the necessary things to make sure that the proper measure, make sure I've got the proper tempo, timing, all of that, etc. So I'm going to assume that you've got a fairly decent knowledge of all of that, or in the very near future you will as your experience grows. But in the midst of the step, it is attack, and then in the next action, I will then move into the parry position as her sword would then at that moment be rising up in order to attack me. Okay? Now, as always, remember that your offhand has a place in all of this. Don't just utilize your sword when you're not utilizing offhand. Just as if you had a dagger or a buckler or a baton or whatever, when this sword moves, this offhand weapon, or open hand as the case is in single sword, has a place to be. So just for frame of reference, right? She starts her step, I will make the attack, and then of course in the next segment we both get in action. I parry the sword and my offhand goes to the upper area in order to close off this upper line. Okay? Just in case she comes off of there. You never know. Let's not leave it up to chance. Another segment of time that you can attack your opponent in is, again, capitalizes on the fact that they are making an action. And that action has to be finished in order for them to be able to then attack you or defend themselves, whatever the case may be. And in this particular instance, unlike when the opponent is stepping, this is done when the blade is retreating. Now again, as my students have heard me say, who knows how many times, a retreating blade is never a threat. So for example, if she was to have made an attack against me and she was too far away, right? The measure just wasn't there for her. She makes her attack. Now as she's recovering, as that sword is retreating away from me, that is an ideal time for me to launch into my attack against her because she has to finish the action. Her sword is moving away, her body is moving away. She has to bring herself back into a ready position before she can do anything else against me. That is an ideal time to make an attack against your opponent, and it will be done in a masterful fashion. Whether you hit or not is irrelevant. What you have to make sure that you are doing is committing yourself to actions that will allow you to survive it after the fact. Both of you hitting each other is unacceptable. You doing it incorrectly and getting killed is unacceptable. So again, in this instance, she makes an attack, she's too far away, she recovers, no-tail lunge, boom, and of course what do we follow with? Immediately covering that sword, because in the next segment of time, she will have an action. This is both martial and competitively smart, and the reason for that is, in a martial context, unless I happen to hit that off switch in the head, let's say even the head was my target, right? Unless I happen to immediately kill her the moment my weapon strikes, she is still alive and can potentially make an attack back against me. So if my target area is anything else, if it's the chest, if it's the belly, if it's the leg, obviously then my opponent does not immediately die, and in the next moment, while my sword is bound up in the target that I struck, she could potentially strike me somewhere and take me with her. That of course is unacceptable, and as the key phrase here is, not masterful. So there is a whole lot more that I could say on this topic, but for the sake of brevity and not wanting to go overly long in this video and inundate you with too much information, I am going to speak to one more instance simply because the person who asked the question had this specifically at the tail end of their question, and that is about utilizing the understanding that they utilize the no-tail lunge against their opponent. They've been relying upon their speed in order to be faster than their opponent, which is not masterful, and they recognize that. And they understand that they can use the offhand, the dagger, the baton, or as is the case with single sword, the empty hand, in order to parry, but they're wondering if they're going to be fast enough to parry an incoming attack at the end of their attack that they have just made. The answer is yes, but again, there's a specific reason why, and you have to implement a specific technique when you do it, and this is it. So, in this particular instance, I'm dealing with a low guard fencer here, right? So, let's say I want to make an attack against my opponent, but let's say, So let's say that I'm fencing against somebody, and for the start, we're going to assume that I've got a high guard opponent. So I've got my opponent in their high guard position there. I want to do a no-tell lunge against them, and I want to make sure that I am able to parry that incoming attack. Now in this particular instance, you make your no-tell attack against them with a combination of what I call a binding maneuver. It's not really a binding maneuver, it's really more of a stringere in this particular instance. But my sword flies out, makes the attack, engages the line of the opponent's weapon such that they are bound out in this particular line of attack. But as we know, what if she disengaged at that exact same moment? She just happened to make that attack against me. Well, clearly I haven't done anything with this, so your offhand then would be looking just like this when you make your attack. It would be stringere attack into my opponent, while my offhand is in the way of all of the vital stuff I want to keep in one piece. Now let's say, for example, I'm dealing with an opponent who is a low guard swordsman, right? So if I want to make sure that I am dealing in a masterful fashion with my opponent, and let's say I'm going to attack her head, but I need to make sure I'm dealing with that weapon down low, right? Okay, so we're going to assume that I did it in the midst of the withdrawing blade, or maybe I did it in the midst of the footwork that she was in the midst of. Doesn't matter. I've chosen that this is the ideal time, and we're going to assume now that I've gotten an ideal position on her weapon, on her body, on the measure, all of that, and I commit to the no-tell lunge. So when I do so, I've made my attack against my opponent, but my offhand needs to be covering that low line because it's the straight line attack. It is the shortest attack that she can make against me, therefore it's the fastest attack I'm going to face, and the most likely attack that I'm going to end up getting hit on a riposte, or if she happened to attack me in the same time as I attacked her, that's the line she's going to follow. However, there's another piece to it. So let's say, for example, that I attack my opponent towards the head, and I do what I'm supposed to do with my offhand, and I cover that low line. So out goes my sword to the headshot. I go into my deep lunge on my no-tell lunge. I've got my hand covering the low line so that way she can't get a straight line attack against me, because let's face it, that is the most likely. But let's say, for example, the very moment that I make my attack against her with the sword, my hand covers the low line. In that very instant, if I don't instantly feel her sword rising up into my hand, it means one of two things, and only two things. One, that she disengaged and is going for a high line instead, or B, she didn't do anything at all. In either case, if I make that attack against my opponent, I've covered the low line and I don't feel anything here, I immediately flip my hand up into the high position. If you have a dagger here, you're flipping the dagger up into that high position. So it looks like this. I'm here and I'm taking the left-handed position because my opponent is recovering from shoulder surgery, so we're going to make this easy on her. But I make my attack, cover the low line, and immediately flip my hand up if I don't instantaneously feel something hitting my hand. And when I say instantaneously, I do mean instant, right? If your front foot has landed and you're not feeling anything on your hand, immediately flip that hand into a high position, because it means only one of two things. They did nothing at all, or they're attacking you high, in which case, because they're following a curving path, it's going to take more time. Time that you can use to your advantage to head them off at the pass. I do it all the time against my opponents. It's particularly easy if you already have something in your hand like a dagger, but your offhand will also move very quickly and very rapidly, and you will intercept your opponent on that high line. And again, you have time to do it because they have to follow a curving path. Curving path takes a long time. Your path is almost straight. You have the shorter distance, you're going to win that race.